Michael Borges, Executive Director, New York Association of School Business Officials, to be followed by Robert Lowry. Looks like Mr. Borges has a split personality here. We got
Yes, well, actually,
two of you.
we'll save you some time. Yeah.
Oh, we got School Boards Association?
Yeah, we got, I'm Mike Borges with the School Business Officials, and we have
Dave Little, School Boards. Bob Lowry from Council of School Superintendents.
Boy, that's great. Thank you.
thought we'd
Just
be
for
efficient.
that, we're going to get more funding for all of your organizations.
Great.
Take
Well,
care of
thank
any
you for
problems.
sticking around to hear us speak. And I want to especially thank my own Senator Kachik for mentioning our report this morning that got released about school insolvency. Just briefly, I know since the hour's late and the time is limited, just want to kind of go briefly over the governor's proposal. I'll just read my reading glasses. Basically, the $603 million increase in school aid is really composed of a $323 million restoration of GEA, so it's no new money there, which leaves about $1.3 billion left to restore, which, if you go with $323 million, is another 4 or 5 years worth of restorations. The remaining $603 is $280 million or more for expense-based aid, which is really reimbursing school districts for expenses that they incurred the previous year. Again, no new money for operating costs. There is $74 million allocated to an undefined fiscal stabilization line. This compares to the $203 million last year that the governor put in for fiscal stabilization. The executive budget proposal on the property tax freeze, again, only seeks to cap our local revenues and not our expenses. We're still waiting on details on how that would work and how it would be implemented. The $2 billion Technology Bond Act, Smart Schools Bond Act, we support the intent, but it would make more sense and cost taxpayers less to fund these technology purchases by increasing hardware and technology aid categories. It makes no sense to borrow money to pay for iPads or tablets that have a shelf life of 3 to 5 years. Pre-K initiative, again, another worthy initiative, and give it unlimited resources, something the state should invest in. But given our current state of limited resources and tax caps and cuts in aid, we need to invest in K-12 first. Restore all the GEA, fully fund foundation aid, and before embarking on any new initiatives, we should invest in K-12. The tax cap, as someone else had mentioned earlier, is going to be 1.46% for the coming school year, further reducing local resources for our schools. Particularly hard, given that the expected increase in TRS is going to be between 6 and 9%. Increases in healthcare costs expected around 7%. And I just read the other day that natural gas costs have doubled in the last couple of weeks. And also the folks from Ossining mentioned that, I think, no, the lady from Buffalo, one of our members from Buffalo, mentioned the fact that their entire state aid increase was going to be taken up by their pension costs. Barbara Smith from Buffalo. The executive budget also fails to address the building aid interest rate recalculation, which will cost school districts approximately $26 million. It's about 500 school districts statewide will lose out on $26 million in building aid because the governor did not include or not omit the rate recalculation like they did in the previous year. Last year, we were able to secure a 2-year moratorium on recalculating the interest rate, which saved school districts about $32 million. Included on our handout is our school aid proposal, which calls for about $2.6 billion in additional school aid and mandate relief over the next year. Although we phase out the GEA over 3 years and phase in the foundation aid formula over the same time period. We also asked for, in our handouts, we also have our report about school insolvency, which examines recent data that puts in perspective the threat of both fiscal and educational insolvency that many school districts face. In the report, it shows that 261 school districts had reductions in fund balances, 544 school districts lost staff, and most troubling are the 206 school districts who lost staff and fund balances during that 3-year time period. During the last 5 school years, between 2008, 2009, and 2012, 2013, schools lost 10% of their professional staff and 3% of their pupils. And this kind of rate of attrition is not sustainable. Also, in terms of mandate relief, again, as many other folks have mentioned, there is minimal, if not any, mandate relief in the governor's proposal. And there's lots of recommendations are out there, small to large, which we think the legislature consider as a way to reducing our expenses. Again, thank you again for letting me the opportunity to speak, and I'll turn it over to, I think Bob's next on the list.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, thank you. Chairwoman Nolan, Chairman DeFrancisco, and other members of the legislature. I'm Bob Lowry, Deputy Director of the New York State Council of School Superintendents. With my testimony is a copy of a report we released 2 weeks ago. You should have already received it, titled Not Out of the Woods. It's our third annual survey of superintendents on financial matters. And the title reflects the conclusion that despite the state aid increases of the last 2 years, too many districts are worried about either financial or educational insolvency or both, and too few have been able to restore cuts to programs, damage to programs over the last several years. Our survey shows that over the next 4 years, over a third of superintendents anticipate that their districts could become financially insolvent, and over 43% say their districts could become educationally insolvent, unable to fund all the state and federal instructional and student service requirements. We also have a chart showing that, again, despite the state aid increase this year, in 19 categories of programs and services, more superintendents anticipate a negative impact on those areas than a positive, except in one area, school safety. And most of the positive responses are from the lower Hudson Valley, the area across the border from Newtown, Connecticut. For the third year in a row, 40% of superintendents anticipate a negative impact from their budget on extra help for students who need it. With the improvements in the state fiscal outlook, with the state aid increases of the last 2 years, I think some optimism was starting to develop that perhaps there was light at the end of the tunnel, that we could begin to make some progress in reversing the damage of the last 2 years. Unfortunately, the governor's budget just doesn't do enough to help districts either with near-term challenges of putting together budgets for next year or the longer-term challenges that many of them worry about. Even with the increase this year, over 60% of the districts in the state would get less help than in 2008-9, 6 years in the past. And if you leave out building aid, the figure rises to over 80%. It's true, as the governor has said, that enrollment has gone down in many districts, but other things have gone up. The consumer price index by 2.2% a year. The contribution rate for the teachers' retirement system is more than doubled. Health insurance premiums for the state, those have gone up by 4% a year. And also mandates, teacher evaluation and principal evaluation mandates, and the Common Core. The governor's budget would increase basic school aid that appears on the school aid runs by $603 million, or 2.9%. The 7 statewide education groups, including our 3 plus NYSSBA and PTA, SANES, and the Big 5, have said $1.5 billion would be needed just to maintain current services, given the limits on the ability to raise money locally through created by the property tax cap. So we see an increase of $1.5 billion is needed, again, just to maintain current services. We oppose the governor's property tax freeze proposal. It would make more sense to start to phase in a circuit breaker instead as a way to provide targeted help to the people who most need help. The freeze would put local leaders in a no-win position. Either they would have to forego revenues, ask for an override, and they'd either have to forego asking voters for an override of the tax cap to give them the revenues they may see as needed to preserve opportunities for students, or ask their residents to forego the rebates that would create the freeze, almost assuring that their budget would be voted down, and then they wouldn't be able to raise their tax levy at all. We also think the proposal to require districts to participate in a shared services or consolidation plan with other districts led by the largest district in their BOCES doesn't make sense. We support efforts to streamline voluntary consolidation, to promote more sharing of services and regional high schools, but many districts have already exhausted the opportunities that are out there to share services, and 8 out of the last 10 attempts to consolidate districts have been voted down. We do support efforts to expand pre-K, and the technology bond issue might do some good. We share the observation that some of the technology that districts need to buy now it isn't appropriate to fund through bond issues, but it could do some good, and it is welcome that the bond issue would support purchase of construction of pre-K space. The last thing I'll say is I've been involved with education policy for over 25 years. I've never seen the level of discord that we have right now. The governor's called for a panel to review implementation of the Common Core. We appreciate the efforts by Senator Flanagan and Assemblywoman Nolan convening hearings on issues related to the Regents' reform agenda. The governor's panel could provide a vehicle for focusing the discussion to ensure that we get thoughtful, constructive solutions developed and put on the table. We do think that one of the reasons why we got here is that policymakers didn't listen to practitioners in the field, so it will be important for this panel to include practicing educators and school district leaders and to listen to what they have to say. I do want to thank you for your efforts in support of improving the rate-setting process for the 853 schools and for your past support, and we look forward to working with you and with our colleagues to produce a budget that does address the long-term challenges that our school districts are still facing.
I'm Dave Little from the School Boards Association. I think perhaps the best way that I can encapsulate the negotiations that are before you is by the analogy that I heard day before yesterday about the veterinarian and taxidermist that went into business together, the sign out front saying, either way, you'll get your dog back. With all due respect, personal respect to the governor, I think from a public policy standpoint, the executive budget proposal that he's put before you for consideration would lead us with a dead dog. You know, we've got an analysis by the Educational Conference Board that we're all members of that would indicate that simply without any additions whatsoever, simply to roll over existing programs and services by cost from this year to next year takes $2.2 billion. With a 1.4% tax cap imposed on school districts, they're able to raise $700 million. That leaves $1.5 billion for the state if they're to stay at the cap. The governor has proposed $608 million. He's proposed a couple $100 million for extraneous programs, perhaps worthwhile programs beyond that, but $608 million directly to support that $1.5 billion that's needed for next year. Quite honestly, that's not a plan for building what he describes as world-class schools of the future. That's a plan for systematically decommissioning our public educational system. We have tremendous efforts ongoing out there to try and address this, shared services, and yet the proposals, when taken in the aggregate that he's proposed, are tremendously destructive. The property tax relief proposal makes great sense, except that you're presupposing that districts, as they have in the past, would stay at or below the cap. The cap, to date, has been an extremely effective mechanism of restraining school spending. Virtually no school districts, statistically, are successful in going over the cap, and at the same time, school districts that stay below it have historically been successful in their budget votes. So to take that amount and say that we're going to reward taxpayers in districts that stay at the cap and then systematically have an amount of money that's less than half of what's required to allow them to get to the cap with their current programs presupposes that you're going to cut programs and services at a tremendous rate. It's in my mind disingenuous to presuppose that school districts would be able to do that when the chart that you'll see in our testimony, you can see your own areas, the areas that you represent, and virtually all areas of the state show that school districts are being funded at 2008, 2009 levels. Quite honestly, what that means is that your local taxpayers have borne the whole brunt of the burden of increases for 5 years. And that's with the tax cap. And school districts were self-imposing a tax cap before there was a statutory one. So the program for a $2 billion bond act, as speculative as that is, and despite the fact that it uses the exact same method of financing that the governor criticized as creating a $10 billion deficit, that would be helpful. Certainly money for pre-K and money for after school and money for teacher bonuses would all be helpful in the overall scheme of things. But the fact of the matter is that none of it makes any sense if you can't pay for the things that you've got already. Why would we have universal pre-K at the expense of cutting half-day and full-day kindergarten programs and send kids home? The plan doesn't make sense as it's written. You've done a good job in the past of trying to synthesize those initial efforts into a final product. We would ask that you make that effort again this year. One thing that I would say in support of the governor's proposal, the one mandate relief proposal that he includes, flexible waivers for special education that would be in compliance with federal law, makes perfect sense. We have a duplicative and costly system in New York State. As the son of the Russell Sage's Director of Special Education, I can tell you that the way that we do things is costly beyond belief to my colleagues around the country. We don't provide services any better, but we provide them in a much more costly manner. And I would ask you to take a look at that and support that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I take your remark as if the patient dies or the dog dies, it's not going to do much good to give them pre-K instruction.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's
if
where
that's
we
a
are.
good analogy or not, but in any event, are you basically saying that you'd like, if you had your druthers, all those special packages, whether it's the $100 million for pre-K, whatever it is for competitive grants for teachers of excellence and all that stuff, it's more important at this point to use those dollars because of the crisis to either eliminate the gap elimination or to drive more money to the foundation aid.
Much as I hate to admit it, I surpassed Bob's years. This is my 30th year, either working in the legislature or working on education with all of you. And I will tell you, I've never seen a 5-year period of time that has been any more, I don't want to say destructive, but as...
Okay, but what's the answer? We'd love to hear the preamble, but what's the answer?
Yeah, we would like to see
Yes.
that. Yeah, competitive
Yeah.
grants don't work for school districts.
We've got to pay for what we've got before we start paying new things.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would say, that's the predominant reaction from our members is this is great stuff, but what about the basics? And, the pre-K proposal, that would be for districts to opt in. I think in order for districts to opt in, they want to be assured that the funding for pre-K is going to be sustained, but also the funding for what comes after, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. So I don't think you're going to be successful phasing in pre-K without taking care of
Right,
K.
and I'm not suggesting that you're against pre-K or anything like that, but I'm just saying that...
If we had to prioritize,
You got to prioritize.
would we prioritize K-12 spending over pre-K spending? I
Or a
would
new
say
program.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Walter has a question. Walter.
There we go. Thank you. The governor has put forth that the property tax is the most onerous tax in the state of New York, and says that the cause of that during both the State of the State and the budget presentation was the number of local governments that we have. It always seemed to me that the number of state mandates that we had drove our property tax. So I'd really like to hear from you. Do you see an opportunity to consolidate and share services that would have significant savings to our property tax, which the school tax is the largest part of that? Or in reality, is it the state mandates that are driving your costs?
They've been sharing services at a dramatic rate for the past 5 years. There are some school districts that even share superintendents at this point and other school officials. There's been tremendous resistance thus far in the legislature to address the concept of regional high schools, which is a middle ground between the mergers and consolidations that have been largely rejected by the vast majority of communities that have proposed them. Regional high schools are a concept that is 40 to 50 years old and successfully used in other states. We haven't been able to try and figure out a construct that makes it work. There are certainly opportunities for further shared services, but at some point you have to figure out whether or not you're going to sustain what you have or provide the opportunities through mandate relief to do something else. Neither the governor nor the legislature has provided that mandate relief thus far to an extent that makes any kind of financial replacement for the kind of aid that we need to move forward.
There actually are 3 regional high schools operating in actually Nassau County, which work really well, and it's beyond my understanding why the region's proposal for regional high schools hasn't really moved forward, because I think we could all endorse the idea of regional high schools as being the less threatening and the least easy, the easier thing to achieve as opposed to consolidation, as Bob was saying. I think the last 4 votes on consolidation of school districts went down in flames. And in a large part because of schools or communities didn't want to lose their identity, and 2, always one of those communities see their tax levies go up and the other one goes down. So until there's a way of addressing the inequities of the merger, you're going to see a lot more of those consolidations fail. So.
Mr. Oaks?
I'd say, the consolidations that have been pursued, the idea of regional high schools, those are more about preserving opportunities for children than reducing costs. There probably are further opportunities for savings in shared services, administrative services, and we ought to pursue them. But central administrative spending, according to the state education department, is 3% of district budgets. If we were creating a state from scratch, we wouldn't have 700 school districts. But in fact, 29 states have more school districts relative to enrollment than we do. That's not the reason why our spending is so high. It is the mandates.
Correct.
Just a quick question. You were talking before about some of the challenges in funding the universal pre-K proposals and whatever. Have you had any sense yet from your membership of how many should the funding be there, how many might take advantage of it, or is you raised the concern of worrying would it be available in the future and whatever, but are these districts even in a position to take advantage of it at this point because of so many of the other uncertainties in their funding?
There are a few that would be in a position to do that, but there is universal skepticism about the longevity of the funding. I think they only need to go as far as foundation aid, the basic funding for school districts. There's not a penny of an increase in foundation aid in this budget. So when you don't have an increase in that, why would you expect to have funding in perpetuity for a brand new program?
And not every school district in the state has full-day kindergarten. So I think before you go to pre-K, you might want to make sure that every school district in the state at least offers full-day kindergarten.
And there's a transportation issue and the construction issue to have the facilities associated with school districts to provide pre-K is based on the speculative proposition of a statewide bond proposition that in itself assumes that there would be support from the highly populated areas of the state that already have broadband access and generally have access to computer hardware for their kids. So the success of that bond proposition, I would say is tenuous at best. And to base the construction of the facilities you need for a $1.5 billion operating proposal for pre-K, to me is tenuous at best.
I asked the commissioner this morning on early childhood, saying maybe would a better proposal be to lump pre-K through 2 and allowing some of those resources if we're trying to focus on early education so that local districts might be able to make some determinations on going to full-day kindergarten, et cetera.
Assemblyman, all I would tell you about that, and certainly from an operational standpoint, the flexibility would be welcome. But in saying that, we need to pay for what we have first. We also recognize that in many areas there's tremendous need for universal pre-K. There are young students that are dramatically in need of an improved environment to be able to be successful later on.
Thank you.
Senator Kruger.
Thank you, gentlemen. I will get back to your questions. I just want to thank you all for incredibly thorough testimony, the 3 different documents that you submitted. And there's a lot of discussion here, but obviously the highlighted theme is when you look at how much money has been removed from the educational system over the last few years, you all find yourselves desperate and your school district's desperate. And I don't think it's really a debate about the pros and cons of UPK, but rather the need to have the education funds to do what you're trying to do with statistically so much less than what you were anticipating having at this point in history. And I'm just curious because the other side of the governor's argument is if he uses this freeze and circuit breaker to require shared services, that it'll all work out within 3 years. So I'm wondering, have you also, because you've done incredible work here, evaluated, can you reduce the number of school districts in 3 years? Can you have a lot of savings that way?
Well, you know, most of the money is in the buildings, you know, the schools. It's not in the central offices. And as David said, we have district sharing superintendents now.
Business officials?
Business officials. I was in the Binghamton area last Thursday evening. Basically, the BOCES is operating all the business offices for all the districts, as I understand
Central
it.
business office.
Yeah, a central business office. So that kind of thing is going on. It is a way to save money. But again, most of the money is in the school buildings. And as we said, voters, often it's the case that school district leaders, superintendents, and boards are ahead of the community, saying, you know, we need to look at consolidation, and often it's more about preserving opportunities for kids than about lowering taxes. But 8 out of the last 10 attempts to merge districts have been voted down, and I think all of the mergers that have been put up for votes since the start of this school year have been rejected. So voters are resistant to doing that. And again, most of the money is in instruction. 75% of school spending is instruction. I would say, you know, there has been consolidation that's gone on. It's consolidation of school buildings. I think in districts with over 5,000 students, over 29% of them have closed at least one school building in the last 3 years, according to our survey. So that's going on. I think people are looking for ways to avoid affecting instruction and other student services. But again, that part of the school budget, central administration, is small to begin with.
Study after study says that there's no real fiscal savings in trying to merge school districts, particularly in New York State, where you have to level up the contracts of the employees within the district, and our money's in people. You know, so if you're trying to do the merger to expand educational opportunities and you're trying to retain the people, and half of the people are making less than the others, and you're going to increase their salary to the new entity, the savings that you have for the few administrators that you lose in the process is more than offset by that, as well as by the increased transportation that you have for schools. The really succinct answer to your question is we can't get there in the third year because we can't get there in the first year. With $608 million, we can't keep districts under the cap. Okay, and everything is predicated on that.
Actually, one of the reports you were talking about, Syracuse University did a study 2 or 3 years ago which looked at school district consolidation, and they found that school districts of less than 1,500, it made sense, but over 1,500, it made no economic sense to merge. So there's no savings involved in merging school districts of a certain size. And you want to kind of go to look at Syracuse University.
And when Syracuse University speaks, people listen.
Yes, that's what it said.
We certainly do.
Senator Katchik.
I just wanted to thank all of your organizations for the work that you do and the amount of time you put into helping us understand the system we're in with the education funding, and I was glad to see this morning. I mean, this is the kind of data we need to understand before we make these decisions, so I appreciate the amount of work and effort to get this out today and help us understand the impact this budget is having and has been, and the past 5 years have had on our school districts. I wanted to thank you.
And I thank your efforts in consolidating the 3 speakers into one time slot.
I also wanted to point out
I'm
that
going to just
we're modeling, Senator. We're just
yes,
modeling.
and I saw that there was a sort of a theme there of the road traveled. You
Yes.
know, I don't know if that was an intentional, but we.
Well, I just want to point out, though, that we did drop off at the beginning of January the school district fact book with the maps, and
I didn't get that.
It was very
dropped it off
helpful.
at your office this morning, so you should have gotten it. If you haven't gotten it, please don't hesitate to contact us. This is very valuable information.
No.